Chapter 14 of The Cat of Bubastes, A Tale of Ancient Egypt. This recording is in the public domain. The Cat of Bubastes by G. A. Henty. Chapter 14 A Prince of Egypt. When Amuba recovered his senses he was lying in a heap at the bottom of the chariot. Two men were standing in the car beside him. The one he supposed to be the driver, the other the owner of the chariot. In a few minutes the chariot turned off through a stately gateway. The driver leaped down and closed the gates, and then led the horses to the steps leading up to a splendid mansion. The man beside him called out, and 2 or 3 slaves ran down the steps. Then he was lifted out, carried into the house, and laid upon a couch. A cup of wine was placed to his lips, and after he had drunk a slave bathed his head with cold water and bandaged up the numerous cuts from which blood was flowing. This greatly refreshed him, and he raised himself on his arm. An order was given, and the slaves left the apartment, and Amuba looking up saw a tall and stately figure standing before him. He recognized him at once, for he had seen him following the king in one of the processions among the princes of Egypt. "Who are you? And is it true what those men whom I found maltreating you averred, that you are the slayer of the Cat of Bubastes?" "My name is Amuba, my lord," the lad said, striving to stand upright; but his questioner signed to him to remain seated. "I am a Rebu taken prisoner of war, and handed as a slave to Ameres, high priest of Osiris. I am not the slayer of the cat, but it is true that I was present at its death, and that it might just as well have been my arrow that accidentally pierced it as that of him who did so." "Then it was an accident?" the noble said. "It was wholly an accident, my lord. We fired at a hawk that had been thinning the pet birds of my master's daughter. One of the arrows struck a tree, and glancing off entered the house in which the cat was kept, and unfortunately caused its death. We regretted the accident bitterly, knowing how sacred was the animal in the sight of the Egyptians." "And not in your sight, young man? You are not yet a follower of the gods of the Egyptians?" "I am not, my lord," Amuba answered; "but at the same time I would not upon any account have willfully done aught to offend the religious opinions of others, although I myself have not been taught to consider the life of a cat as of more value than that of other animals." "Then you worship the gods of your own people?" Amuba was silent for a moment. "I would answer frankly, my lord, and I hope that you will not be displeased. Since I have come to Egypt I have come to think that neither the gods of the Egyptians nor the gods my fathers worshiped are the true gods. I believe that there is one great God over all, and that the others are but as it were his attributes, which men worship under the name of gods." The Egyptian uttered an exclamation of surprise. "Whence did you obtain such a belief as this?" he asked. Amuba was silent. "It must have been from Ameres himself," the noble went on, seeing that the lad was reluctant to answer. "I knew him well, and also that he carried to an extreme the knowledge he had gained. But how came it that he should speak of such matters to you, a slave?" "My master was good enough to make me a companion and friend to his son rather than a servant to him," Amuba replied, "partly because he thought that I should lead him to a more active life, which he needed, for he was overstudious; partly because I had high rank in my own country, of which my father was the king. But he never spoke of this matter until after the accident of the cat. My friend Chebron was utterly cast down at the sin he thought he had committed, and would at once have denounced himself, preferring death to living with such a burden upon his mind. Then his father, seeing that his whole life would be embittered, and that he would probably be forced to fly from Egypt and dwell in some other land, told him the belief which he himself held. I believed this all the more readily because I had heard much the same from an Israelite maiden who served my master's daughter." Again Amuba's listener uttered an exclamation of surprise. "I knew not," he said, after a pause, "that there was an Israelite who still adhered to the religion of their ancestors." "The maiden told me that for the most part they had taken to the worship of the Egyptians, and indeed, so far as she knew, she was the last who clung to the old belief. She had been brought up by a great grandfather who had been driven from his people and forced to dwell apart, because he reproached them for having forsaken their God, and he instructed her in the faith he held, which was that there was but one God over all the earth." "Do you know who I am?" the noble asked abruptly. "I know that you are one of the princes of the land, my lord, for I have seen you in a procession following closely behind the king with his sons and other princes." I am also an Israelite. It seems strange to you, doubtless," he went on, as Amuba stared in astonishment at hearing a prince of Egypt declare himself as belonging to the hated race. "Many years ago, at the time I was an infant, there was a great persecution of the Israelites, and as is supposed my father and mother, fearing for my life, placed me in a little cradle and set me afloat on the water. It chanced, or was it chance or the will of God, that the water took me to the spot where the Princess Thermutis, the daughter of the then king, was bathing with her maidens. She had compassion upon me and adopted me, and as I grew up I had all the rights and privileges of her son, and rank, as you say, with the princes of Egypt. She called me Moses, for that was the name, as it seems, that was writ upon a piece of papyrus fastened to my cradle. I was instructed in all the learning of the Egyptians, and grew up as one of them. So I lived for many years, and had almost forgotten that I was not one of them. But now—" And here he stopped, and began thoughtfully to pace up and down the apartment. "What has become of the maiden of whom you spoke?" he asked, suddenly stopping before Amuba. "That I know not, my lord. Upon the day that Ameres was murdered by the mob his little daughter was carried off, and Ruth, for that is her name, has also been missing ever since. It is for that reason we have lingered here, otherwise we should have fled at once." "You and the son of Ameres?" "Yes, my lord, and another Rebu, one of my father's warriors, who was a fellow captive with me and also slave of Ameres. The high priest had great confidence in him, and committed to him the mission of aiding Chebron to escape, and of conducting us if possible back to my own land. But when we found that my young mistress was missing, we decided to remain to search for her." "What will you do when you find her?" "If we can rescue her from those who have carried her away, we shall hand her over to her mother, and then leave the land as we had intended. Unless, indeed, you, my lord, in your goodness, could obtain for Chebron a pardon for an offense which was wholly accidental." "That I can never do," Moses said. "This is wholly beyond my power. The king himself could not withstand the demand of the populace for his life. Until lately I might have in some way aided you, but I have no longer influence, and have myself fallen into disgrace at court." After again pacing the apartment for some time, Moses went on. "If you find this little Israelite maiden, tell her she is not the last of the Israelites who believes in the God of Abraham, our ancestor. Tell her that Moses also holds to the faith. You again look surprised, young man, and you may well be so, seeing that I have from the days of my infancy been separated from my people. But our priests keep accurate records of all things connected with the countries and religion of the people with whom we come in contact. Thus, then, it was easy for me, who have access to all the stores of knowledge, to examine the rolls recording the first coming of my people, the rule of Joseph, the great governor, the coming of his relations here and their settlement in the country. Thus I learned that they worshiped one God, whom they believed to be the only God in the world. I have been interested deeply in the learning of the priesthood, and have long seen that behind all the forms and mysteries of the Egyptian religion this central idea seemed to be hidden. None with whom I have spoken acknowledged boldly that it was so, but I heard reports that Ameres was bold enough to entertain the idea that there was but one God, and that our far back ancestors, who had first worshipped him under the various attributes they ascribed to him, came in course of time to lose the truth altogether, and to regard shadows as substances. Therefore, I said to myself, I too will believe in the one God worshipped by my forefathers, hoping that in time it may be that I may learn more of him. Until the last 2 or 3 years I have been content to live as one of the Egyptian princes, but of late my heart has turned much to my oppressed people, and I have determined upon doing what I can to relieve their burden. I have even raised my voice in the council in their favor, and this has created a coldness between the court and myself. They consider that I, having had the honor of adoption into the royal family, should myself forget, and allow others to forget, what they regard as my base origin. Sometimes I own that I myself wonder that I should feel so drawn toward them, and even wish that I could forget my origin and give my whole mind to the duties and pleasures of my present rank. But I feel moved by a spirit stronger than my own. But we must talk no longer. I see that you are now stronger. Do you think you can walk?" "Oh, yes," Amuba replied, getting up and walking across the apartment. "I have not lost much blood, and was only dizzy from their blows." "Then it is better that you should leave at once. The people from whom I snatched you will have carried the news speedily to the city, and officials will doubtless soon arrive here to demand that you be given up to them. Take therefore another draught of